This August marks the 7th year anniversary of the genocide of the Yazidis by the Islamic State. So, who are the Yazidis? What is their faith? Why were and still are they being persecuted? The Yazidis are adherents of an ancient faith that stretches back to millennia. The roots of their persecution, too, stretches back centuries. The Yazidis thrived in the Kurdish regions spanning northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. They currently have around 750,000 adherents, a majority of whom are in the Sinjar district of northern Iraq, and a few thousand in Syria, Armenia, and Georgia. After years of mischaracterization and misunderstanding, scholars have finally now recognized that the Yazidi faith is distinctively Indo-Iranian. We will first look at the Yazidi faith and then look at startling similarities with Hinduism and other Dharmic faiths, and finally take a look at their persecution. The emergence of the Yazidis can be traced to around 1750 BCE with a lower limit of 1200 BCE. To better understand their origins, we need to travel back through the past to see the people and the forces that were active in these areas at that timeline. So who was here at around 1700 BCE? We come across the Mittanis. The Mittanis were an ancient enigmatic dynasty that ruled the area from 1700 BCE to 1200 BCE, completely overlapping the origin areas and timelines of the Yazidis. As you can see in this map, all of the Yazidi territories were at the very core of the Mittani Empire. The Mittanis were very Vedic in nature, even their names were Sanskritized. Kirta was the king credited with the founding of the dynasty. The next king was Sutarana I, followed by Bharatarana and then Parasushaktra. The Mittani also had powerful and deep connections with the ancient Egyptians. Arthadhama was one of the ancient Mittani kings whose daughter was married to an Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose IV. Another king of interest is the Mittani king Tusharata. Needless to say, Tusharata is a very Indic name. Tusharata was the father-in-law of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. His daughter Tadukipa was married to the pharaoh. I will make a more detailed episode on the Mittanis and their connection to the Egyptians later. Coming back to the Yazidi faith, like the ancient Indian Vedic traditions, the Yazidis too were an oral tradition. They had no written texts until recently, and their sacred texts were passed on from father to son or by the priests, the peers. The priestly class of the Yazidis were called the peers, and the lay people are the murids. They were a group of people who memorized these religious texts and would travel across the region transmitting the knowledge to other Yazidis, and these were the quibbles. Because many of these texts were restricted to outsiders and the scriptures transmitted orally, a lot of symbolism might be lost in translation and transmission. Many of the symbolisms were misunderstood, and this has led to some groups demonizing them as Satan worshippers, as devil worshippers, and in fact, in a way, this led to the entire world turning a blind eye to their continued persecution over centuries. If we take a deep look at the religion of the Yazidis, the philosophy of the Yazidis, we begin to understand what the faith really is. The word that the Yazidi used for God is Qadi. Western scholars describe that this Qadi is a very nebulous concept, and it's indeed difficult to get a good idea of the Qadi. This is because the Qadi represented the infinite consciousness, like the Brahman, the Shivam, and it could be both in the unmanifest state and in the manifest state. The Yazidis also believed that 7 angels were manifested by the Qadi. Chief among the creative manifestations is Malek Tawus, represented by a peacock. So Malek Tawus was the emanation of the Qadi and was responsible for creation and is symbolized by a peacock. association of Malek Taus with the peacock is extremely interesting, both from a religious and a historical perspective. In addition to the peacock, the Yazidis also had several emblems of snakes carved onto their places of worship. So, what are the symbolisms of the snake, and what is the symbolism of the peacock? In Eastern Dharmic faiths, the snake symbolized the cycle of birth and death. The way the snake sheds its skin and gets a new one is a metaphysical symbolism of how the soul sheds one body and gets another when it's trapped in the cycle of birth and death. Peacocks, which actively fight against snakes, symbolized liberation from rebirth. In Hinduism, the mount of Lord Muruga, Kartikeya, who epitomizes jnana, knowledge, is a peacock. Lord Kartikeya is regarded as the destroyer of negative tendencies and the vasanas and samskaras that keep us tied to this cycle of birth and death. Lord Krishna is represented as being adorned with the feather of a peacock on his head. Many other deities like Indra too are associated with the peacock. The other symbolism of the peacock is due to the vibrant feathers of the peacock. This symbolizes the concept of infinite shapes and forms stemming from a single source. It reiterates the fact that all that exists is the Supreme Absolute, the Brahman, the infinite consciousness, which assumes infinite shapes and forms in its dance of delight. Now, historically, the Yazidi association with the peacock is very interesting. The homeland of the peacock, Pavo Cristatus, is the Indian subcontinent, and the peacock did not make its way into the west of the Indian subcontinent until the 6th century BCE. The origin of the Yazidis is traced back to 1700 BCE to at least 1300 BCE as a lower limit, which is still a startling 700 years before the peacock was ever seen in that region. And this is something amazing. The only way that the Yazidis would have the peacock as their emblem is if they came out of a place which had peacocks. The migration did not happen the other way, because the peacock went out of India. This also reinforces the fact that ancient Dharmic civilizations did exist all over the ancient world, which had good cultural contacts with each other. Another similarity between Hinduism and the Yazidi faith is that the Yazidis believe in reincarnation. In fact, Yazidis use the metaphor of change of garment to describe the process of reincarnation. And this symbolism is central to their faith. The soul changing its body is compared to the change of one's shirt. Kiras gorin is the word that they use to describe this. The specific analogy is identical to the one in the Bhagavad Gita, and incidentally is also one of the very important verses of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita states, Vasamsi jirnani yatha vihaya navani ghrhnani naroparani tatha sharirani vihaya jirna nyanyani samyati navani dehi. As a person sheds worn out garments and wears new ones, likewise, at the time of death, the soul casts off its worn out body and enters a new one. This is identical to how the Yazidis symbolized reincarnation. So, the Yazidis believed in the fact of an all-pervading Supreme Absolute, the Quadi, and the creative potency of the Quadi manifested as Malek Tavus and the cycle of birth and death. But in addition, there are several more similarities. The Yazidis believed in the cyclical nature of the universe. The Yazidis also have the concept of the Brahmanda. The Yazidi New Year falls on the first Wednesday on or after 14th April, according to the Gregorian calendar. And this is when many of the regions in India, from the south to the north, celebrate their New Year. The Yazidis do not convert, the Yazidis do not declare non-believers as heretics, and to date, the Yazidis have not persecuted any other faith. So even the 7 angels can be compared to the 7 sages, the Saptarishis, and even there, sage Kashyapa is credited as being the progenitor of all living beings that exist in Brahma's universe. The Yazidi address their prayer facing the sun. Now, we come to the persecution of the Yazidis. The persecution of the Yazidis stretches back centuries. Their first recorded persecution started from the year 637 in the Common Era. In 1980, Islamic Kurdish armies massacred the Yazidis in the Hakkar region. In the year 1414, sacred shrines at Lalish were destroyed, and the bones of their great saint Adi were taken out of the tomb and burnt. The atrocities continued. In the year 1792, Muhammad Pasha al-Jalili, the mayor of Mosul, burnt 8 Yazidi villages in the Sinjar region. And in the 1800s, Badir Khan Beg, the Kurdish ruler of Bhutan, carried out repeated massacres of the Yazidis. Villages were burnt, and the captured Yazidis were given 2 options: to convert or die. In the centuries that followed, discrimination and blatant persecution kept them at the bottom of the social pyramid. The Yazidis lived in rampant poverty. Starting from 2004, in the aftermath of the US invasion of Iraq, Yazidis were targeted. Flyers in Mosul declared divine rewards for those who killed the Yazidis. Young children were executed, but the media did not carry any news of their murders. Their lives were deemed less valuable in the grand scheme of things. But all of this paled in comparison to what happened in 2014. On the 3rd of August, the Islamic State entered the Sinjar area, which was predominantly Yazidi. This is a horrifying and a ghastly episode in recent history that has to be documented. As soon as the forces of Islamic State gained control of Sinjar, many of the Yazidi men were killed. Their wives were taken away for forced marriage with the soldiers of the Islamic State. Thousands of Yazidi men who refused to convert and their male children were killed in Sinjar and nearby villages of Kocho, Solag, Hardan, and Kiniye. Women and children were forced to become sex slaves for ISIS fighters who claimed religious justification. The women and children were auctioned off in slave markets. Women who were in their early stages of pregnancy had their pregnancies aborted. Around 7,000 women were captured and forced into sex slavery. Women deemed too old and those too advanced in their pregnancy were shot dead and buried along with the men in mass graves. The world watched. Some even died to avoid captivity. A 17-year-old Yazidi girl doused herself in gasoline and set herself on fire, preferring to die rather than end up being a slave of the Islamic State fighters. But the atrocities continued. More than 40,000 Yazidi fled to the Mount Sinjar to hide from Islamic State's onslaught. The Yazidis had no food or water, and the ISIS forces laid siege to the mountain. Many perished. It was December by the time they were finally freed. So now, the Yazidis, a Dharmic Indic people after centuries and millennia of persecution, still stand by their faith. Some tried to identify themselves as monotheists to better integrate with those around them, so they could just get some respect. But history has shown that even those sympathetic to the Yazidi cause do not seem to respect their faith. The repeated messaging and demonization of the Yazidis as devil worshippers was not just restricted to religious fanatics. Even academics wrote research papers calling the Yazidi devil worshippers. 100 years ago, in 1911, British anthropologist W.B. Hurd publishes this paper where he describes the Yazidi persecution. He documents the massacre of the Yazidis by Badr Khan Bey, but he immediately goes on to demean the Yazidi faith. Right off the bat, even in the introduction, he calls them devil worshippers. He states that they venerate the devil and yet recognize the existence of a benign deity. he misunderstands the different shades that can be attributed to the creative potency of the infinite absolute. And he further goes on to berate the faith for not being Abrahamic enough. He says that the faith is lacking in spiritual inspiration, philosophical depth, and he calls out that there is no inspiring example of a great founder, no holy book accessible to the multitude, and no code of sacred laws to bind together the fabric of their religion. He berates the faith here for not being Abrahamic enough. Abrahamic faiths, which were distinctly dual and celebrated just the act of creation, imposed their own interpretation onto the Yazidis. Malek Taus was reinterpreted as a fallen angel expelled from paradise for disobedience to the will of God. Defamation crusades were carried out against the Yazidis. Many spurious texts were written in the name of the Yazidis as well. The Yazidi Book of Revelation, which is sometimes quoted, has not been confirmed as authentic by the Yazidis themselves. And if you read the book, you will immediately see that hymns have definitely been made up because they mention names and characters who did not appear on the world 1,000 years after the origin of the Yazidis. To understand why Malek Taus might sometimes be misinterpreted as negative, we need to understand creation from the point of Dharmic faiths. Even though creation and this world experience can be considered the dance of delight of the Supreme Absolute, the aim of Dharmic faiths is to transcend the material. The aim is to realize God, not to worship an external entity for material creation. In Hinduism, we talk about the creation of the world by Brahma, the manifestation of the creative potency of the Supreme Absolute, the Brahman, the infinite consciousness, the Shivam. But Vedantically, there are versions where avidya, ignorance, is the reason for the manifestation, and there are versions where Leela, the dance of delight, is the reason for the manifestation. You could say that, in a way, the creation of the material world and being trapped by it is seen as a means to impeding liberation, which is why Brahma's main imperfection is shown as falling in love with creation. But still, Brahma is the manifestation of the Supreme Absolute and a qualified aspect of the God energy in his own right. So, in a way, you could say that the act of creation and being in the material world could be interpreted as a fall that takes one away from the true nature, which is Sat Chit Ananda, pure consciousness bliss. By the way, creation is not negative. Dharmic faiths allow one to quench desires dharmically because it is the experience of the Supreme Absolute, and then realize the true nature of reality. Experience the material world, but when the experience ends, leave the world without any desires and move onwards towards liberation. And this is the real meaning of Kwadi and Malek Taus, the creative potency of the infinite God energy. But having said all that, as a side note, even if a group of people do worship what another group perceives as the devil, is it okay to kill them? If you want to murder everyone who does not believe in your version of God, then you're not that different from a devil. So this is the story, the ongoing saga of the Yazidi, a group who the world has collectively ignored in their tragedy. Thousands of Yazidi are still missing. Most of them who were held by ISIS may either be dead or may have been trafficked, and for many Yazidis, news of death offers relief compared to what ordeal the living might have to go through. The Yazidis are still undergoing persecution, and it is the duty of every Dharmic state and its citizens to stand up and provide assistance and asylum to these persecuted people. And this is one episode, probably the only one, where I would request you to share so that more people are made aware of the heinous atrocities that were committed against the Yazidis. As always, the known is a drop and the unknown an ocean. Peace.